Okay, hey everybody. Welcome to week 5. Um, there's just one lecture this week, and look, this is just goes to illustrate how hard it is to do all of Hawaiian history in one term. Kawi could be half a term to a class by himself. We're going to cover him in one lecture. Anyway, the other thing you're doing this week, so half the class is going to be the lecture. The other thing I want you guys to do this week is get together with your groups and go through the document that I sent. And there's more information, but as a group, go through that document. Have your own ideas. Like read the instruction sheet. Once you've read the instructions, go and read the document. And when you go to discuss things with your group, have something prepared to talk about. Don't just everybody sit there and be like, I guess we should read it now. Read the document first. It's a constitution that was approved under Kawi. The copy that you have has English. But actually, it starts in Hawaiian without any okinas or kahako. Modern Hawaiian with the okinas and kahako, and then in English. And then there's notes over on the side. So read through all of those and just get a sense. Sorry, if you read through the English and the notes for sure. If you can read in Hawaiian, go through all of them and see if there's exceptions. You see if there's things that you find that maybe you disagree with the translation, because that's the official translation. So like try and see like, is there are there things here that I think have been missed or are off? Notice one shoulder is way lower than the other. Oh, okay. That's weird. Oh, I'm leaning this way. Yeah, so go through, please do that. And keep in mind from this lecture where that constitution fits into things. Okay, let's get to it. Shrink me down. Throw me over there. Let's do this. So when Kawi takes over, 1832. Sorry, I saw 1831. I got very confused. I was like, that's not right. But he's going to take over in 1832 when Kahumanu dies. Even though he has been king technically since 1825, he was a child. And not only was he a child, but he was a child while Kahumanu was around. And Kahumanu was not going to give anyone power, let alone a child. She wasn't going to give Liho power. She sure as hell wasn't going to give Kawi any power. So he's going to really take over rule in 1832. And that's around, like, he becomes an adult, but also that's when Kahumanu dies. If she lived to be 90, he would continue not being king. But when he takes over, he has a bunch of problems, and these are issues that he's going to face, but Kamehameha the First had faced, Kahumanu had faced, and the monarchs after him will face. The first is the population issue. We continue to see the population decline. During his reign, 1831, you're looking at 130,000 people, and that's a pretty good count. That's an actual census. But even if you go at the low balls of 200,000 in 1870, which would be way low based on most of the estimates, you're still looking at a drop of what, 30% of the population in 50 years. If you look at something like the 400,000 or even a 300,000, that's more than 50% of the population dropped in 50 years. Then 1831 to 1853, it's going to drop down to 73,000. So that's one of the reasons people look at the really, like, the 200,000 number, and it's like, that seems really suspicious that only 70,000 people, the population declined by 70,000 between the 1770s and 1831, when a lot of these diseases are first hitting Hawaii and there's absolutely no immunity or resistance, versus another 50,000, actually, wait, 60,000 dying off after that in the next 20 years. but he's going to have to deal with that. He's going to have to deal with death. He's going to have to deal with disease. He's going to have to deal with there's a your what happens to your morale when there's that many deaths around. That's something that they're really going to have to try and tackle, and he's not going to be able to. I mean, because at the end of the day, no matter what you do, immunity is not there, and that's what's really killing people is the lack of any sort of real immunity. Another thing that's going on is foreign aggression. The foreign powers had not gotten any less aggressive during this era. Let me try and fix that a little bit. Cook is the first one to show up in Hawaii from Europe, and one of he got killed. But the reason he got killed is he was trying to kidnap the ruling chief of the island, and Cook was arguably one of the least aggressive of the explorers of the time. Later on, the ship's captains get really aggressive. We saw that with the Olowalu massacre, and then the U.S. Navy is getting really aggressive too with sending Percival, and then the guy who comes after them, like who was nicer. He wasn't Mad Jack, but at the same time, made it very clear that the U.S. will continue to show up and ask pointed questions with large battleships until Hawaii paid off the debt or agreed to something in order to pay off the debt. While that's going on, and that's just in Hawaii, you're also dealing with foreign aggression. During his rule, he's going to be dealing a lot with foreign aggression. 1838, the French are going to take Tahiti. And we have this pretty close relationship with Tahiti. Kamehameha at one point, he's trying to marry off Nahianaena to one of the Tahitians. The French are going to invade and take over Tahiti in 1838. They're going to do the same thing in the Marquesas in 1840. And in 1839, right off of the backs of the French invading Tahiti, they're going to show up in Honolulu for what's called the Laplace Affair. And essentially, French warships are going to show up in Honolulu, and they are going to demand a bunch of money and steal one of the king's ships in response to anti-Catholic, various anti-Catholic measures that Kamehameha III took, in addition to the ones that Kaahumanu had taken during her reign. So, man, Hawaii is a small place. At the end of the day, like, there's 73,000 of us. That's how many people are about in the British Navy. So we have to, that has to be taken into account. So let's take a look at, we've seen some of the things he's going to have to be dealing with. Now let's look at the king himself. Kauai Keaoli, Kamehameha III. So he's born around 1814. When Kamehameha dies, he's 5. When Kaahumanu, Kaahumanu sits down with Keopuolani and Kaahumanu sit down with him to eat. Imagine that your father just died, your mother sit down with you to eat, and either it's going to overthrow the Kapu system or your brother's going to have to kill all of you. He's 5, so hopefully he didn't understand most of that, but that's a lot of crap going on, and that's before he's even conscious of things. His brother Liholiho will die in 1825, so when he's 11 he inherits rule, but that's it, he just inherits rule. He has a really high genealogy, mostly through Keopuolani, but then his father had so much mana as Kamehameha, that he has a lot of mana, but he has no power, because he's still a kid. He's the child king, and child kings, it's a bad idea to put any power in the hands of a child king. But in this particular case, he's a child king that Kaahumanu sees as a potential threat, and therefore she does whatever she can to keep him from getting any sort of power, any sort of independence. She refuses to give him any land. He is the king, and she refuses to allow him to have lands. And she actually punishes Boki when Boki says, well, she leaves Kauai Keaoli in the care of Liliha and Boki, partly to keep him away from the court. And when Boki gives Kawikeoli some of Boki's personal lands, he gives it to the king. Ka'ahumanu is incredibly upset because she wants, even though he's still a child, she wants to keep him very much like dependent on her. Um, like Boki and like Lilia is not too fond of the missionaries. He does go to like he is educated by the missionaries. Um, doesn't like them much. Doesn't like this idea that like I mean the missionaries treated him pretty poorly. They treated Nahiana, his sister, pretty poorly. Essentially, they saw it as their job um, to punish the sort of pride out of him. He's a king and a monarch, and they see him as a little heathen boy, and they make him understand that that's how they feel about him. And as long as Kahumanu supports them, um, he doesn't really have that much of a say in it. Um, that will come in important later. 1832, Kahumanu dies. Um, he is, let's see, 18. Um, as soon as Kahumanu dies, he essentially declares a rejection of Christianity. He is the sole ruler now. He declares a rejection of Christianity. Um, he voids all of her religious laws, and the only laws that are left are murder, theft, and assault. Those are the only ones that he says are now kingdom-wide laws. Everything else is up to the governors, and he's living on Oahu. And just like Boki and Liliha, he has a lot of chiefs around them, young chiefs who are rebelling against the Christian rules, against the Sabbath rules, etc. And um, yeah, he just goes. His supporters were called the Hulumanu, the bird feathers. There's all these kind of cool stories about like they bring back all of these practices and things that the missionaries had tried to get rid of. Some of them are like small things, like all of a sudden people can fly kites again. Um, there's hula is out in the open again. There's this one case where this Ka'u chiefess that's living on Oahu appears at a party. She gets out of her carriage. She's wearing this like bright red um, like gown, and she's wearing this bright red gown, and she's from Ka'u. She gets out of the party. She gets to the front of the party. She strips the whole thing off and burns it, and then walks into the party, which for the missionaries was just like, what just happened? There's nakedness. That's horrible. For a lot of the Hawaiians, they're like, she's from Ka'u. She had a bright red dress that she lit on fire. That was an offering to Pele. And then when the missionaries found that out, they're even more pissed. But there's this huge rejection, and one of the things that's happening is Nahi Ena was his sister, so he's deeply in love with Nahi Ena, and this is following on, this is following back on like there's a Hawaiian tradition of like high chiefs, basically inbreeding in order to maintain the purity of their line, and there's like clearly some genetic issues with this, but in this particular case, traditional chiefs are telling him that you and Nahiana Ana should be together. He seems to be deeply in love with Nahiana Ana, and it depend. There's like differing sources, but it does seem that she like this was a mutual sort of love for each other. But she's been educated by the Christian chiefs. She's much more in tune with Kahumanu Ma, like the people around Kahumanu, and they marry her off to somebody else. And that's in 1835, and this is after 3 years of him sort of rejecting Christianity. 1836, she dies. She and her infant child die, and a lot of the people around the court suspected that the child was actually Kamehameha III. Now, whether or not the child was Kamehameha III, it seems pretty clear that Kamehameha III was going to claim the child as his own, because he loved Nahiana Ana so much that the child would be his regardless. And then he goes into deep, deep depression. Now, he's already drinking. He's already pretty depressed. A lot of people are depressed. You see that much death around you, you will be depressed. Not to mention if you're an 18-year-old running an entire kingdom, you get to drink whatever you want. After this, he goes into a deep depression, gets super drunk, and basically just falls back under the mission influence. And from then on, he follows a lot in the footsteps of Kahumanu, not so much as a powerful politician and leader, but the footsteps of Kahumanu in terms of creating this theocracy within Hawaii, this sort of religious rule in Hawaii, and largely following the lead of not just the missionaries, but a lot of the Hawaiians that had been trained and were close with the missionaries, guys like David Malo, David Papa'i'i, or John Papa'i'i. And so what we see coming out of not just like missionaries and other haole that are in Hawaii, but these Hawaiians that had been sort of educated at Lahaina Luna, that had been researching some of these things, is an attempt to create a written constitution that will reflect both Hawaiian tradition and also be intelligible to outsiders. And the thinking was, if there's a written constitution, it'll be much easier for them to get diplomatic recognition. It'll be much easier for them to deal with foreigners, to get foreigners to admit that Hawaii is is a basically what they would see as a civilized nation, and allow Hawaii to deal with them diplomatically on an equal basis, and also to deal with all these people who are coming in, the ships, etc., by having like a written code of law. And so this is the Kumu Kanawai, the source of law. And the 1840 Constitution sets the king as the head of the government, with a cabinet under him. The first cabinet is going to, and the cabinet are the people, basically all the people that run the different departments of the government. In this particular government, it is going to be mostly haole, and that's going to be true until Kalakawa's time, in part because there's more haole out there that have legal training, etc., that are experienced in how to run these things. Like it is very much, the structure very much follows haole patterns of governance. The legislature themselves initially were all Hawaiian. The two houses, the nobles and the commoners. The nobles at first were actually just all the ali'i nui that were left, the high chiefs that were left. But eventually it started to be the king would appoint people to the House of Nobles, partly because so many of the ali'i nui were dying off. And the commoners were the House of Representatives, essentially. They're elected by the population. And by 1850, when haole are allowed to, basically, when haole start running these things, or being able to run, some haole will essentially, because they have more experience in how to run a legislature and like experience in how legislatures work, they're able to manipulate them much better. And some will do so in favor, in sort of the, they'll do so under Kamehameha III, in ways that'll sort of be trying to look out for their own interests, and some will be trying to look out for the kingdom's interests, and some will try to look out for the king's interests. But they're all going to be very much guided by the ideas and principles of mostly America, but also England. Like they are going to be foreigners running a government in Hawaii. Like regardless of their intent, like that is still an essential part of what's happening. But the Constitution is also going to set up like all the things that you need for a modern government. It's going to set up a tax base, like who gets taxed, what are the taxes used for, how are you allowed to spend taxes, how are you allowed to raise and lower taxes. It sets up an administration for the schools. So we will have a national school system after 1840 that like most countries will not have until the 20th century. It sets up a judiciary, it sets up a legal system, and it sets up a way to pay for and create and vote on infrastructure, for roads, for docks, etc. And this is a pretty big thing. There's a lot of criticism of the 1840 Constitution as taking away the power of the king and basically breaking the relationship that the people and the king had together. On the other hand, it also helps set up a government that's going to be internationally recognized. You can set down like different people from different parts of like Hawaiian historians and political scientists, etc., and drop the 1840 Constitution from them, and it'll be a wide spectrum of people. Some people are absolutely disgusted by it, and some people are absolutely thrilled by it, and in between, there's just a range in between. Um, but as far as history goes, it happened, and it quite clearly sets up this new government, but it also creates a way for it creates a new government that is very easy for Haole, and not just like people who are ethnically Haole, but specifically people who are coming from well, mostly New England, but coming from other places that have experience with this types of government, to be able to better manage and better navigate them than most Hawaiians would be, because they're just not used to this system of government for another generation. That'll be less true in the 1880s, but in the 1830s, 1840s, very few Hawaiians would have an understanding of this government at all. Um, and this is one of the things that they're building towards is international recognition, because after 1838 and the Tahitians getting taken over, 1839 the French show up in Hawaii. One of the things that we want is international recognition. We don't want to lose our independence. And when we try to tell the French to back off, they're like, we don't have any treaties with you. We have no responsibility. We have no relationship with you. So getting international recognition, essentially getting the international community to recognize Hawaii's independence, was an important part of the 1840 Constitution, but it's also an important part of basically all the kingdom's efforts up until 1843. So, late 1842, early 1843, the king is planning a diplomatic trip, not for himself, but for William Richards, who is a former missionary that works for the king now, and Timoteo Ha'alilo, who was a supporter of the king, who had been in various government positions, and they have a relationship with the head of the Hudson Bay Company, which is an English company in Canada. And that guy says, look, I can probably get you an in with the British Prime Minister and the foreign affairs people in foreign affairs in England, in order to start pushing for treaties in England. If you start making the inroads in England, you can probably use that to get the Americans and the French aboard too. If you get the Americans, the British, and the French, I mean, those are the major foreign powers in the Pacific. Everyone else in Europe, etc., would just sort of sign off on this thing. And so, yeah, they go to the U.S. They work out something, but it can't be approved in the U.S. just through a deal with the Secretary of State. They actually have to get that passed through Congress. But they have a deal with the U.S. where the U.S. says, okay, if the British and French recognize you, we'll push this thing through the Senate. We'll get the treaty signed. And then they go to England, and they're working on this in France, and they're working on this in England, and they're actually getting closer and closer. Meanwhile, down at the docks in Honolulu, there was a British representative who's basically he was a British merchant who, whenever the British government needed something, or a British sailor or someone got in trouble in Honolulu, they would go to Charlton, and Charlton was the one who would communicate back to the British government. He signed into some shady land deals, and apparently was like one of the most widely disliked people in Honolulu by like Hawaiians and by non-Hawaiians alike. And he gets screwed on this land deal, and he did get screwed on this land deal, but not by the government, but by actually chiefs who had already passed away. And then he decides that instead of trying to deal with that, in Hawaii, he goes to the head of the British fleet in South America. The British fleet that is sort of touring around South America and blowing shit up once in a while, and gets that guy, asks them to do something. And so they send over Lord Paulette, and Lord Paulette his father was the groom of the throne. Oh no, the groom of the, what's it called? The groom of the chamber. So he'd been the last groom of the chamber, and that's the person who goes into the bathroom with the king and wipes the royal behind, which sounds like a humiliating task to the modern eye, but this was often one of the most powerful people in the kingdom, outside of the immediate circle of power. Like, this is the person who had the king's ear. Paulette himself, his father had a high position. He inherited prestige, he inherited money, but he didn't do anything for himself, and he was looking for a way to establish himself. And this presented him with a way to establish himself. And he kind of got in his head that he was going to go to Hawaii, and he was going to like sort of win this big victory for England and for the British Empire. by coming to Hawaii and forcing them to recognize Charlton and then push a treaty on Hawaii that was going to essentially give the British rights in Hawaii and rights over Hawaii, an unfair treaty. And this is something that they're doing all over the world. And so he comes to Hawaii and he's being a little bit pushy. And at a certain point, Kauai Keo'oli and his they call him the Minister of Everything. Oh my God, why am I blanking on his name? Because it's late. It's still a prominent family. My God, Judd. Judd is kind of running the government for him. Is running the cabinet, and he gets tells Judd, like, deal with this guy. And Judd tries dealing with Paulette for a while, and Judd finally says, screw it. You know what? We'll sign over the whole kingdom to you under protest. And we are going to protest the British government that you made things so impossible for us to operate while you were here, that we are surrendering to the British government, and we're saying it's your fault. So if the British government approves of this, hey, you're a hero, just like you wanted. But if they don't approve of this, then you just took over a friendly country. Sucker. And then Paulette tries to run Hawaii for a while, and it ends poorly because he finds out he's really better at running a single ship than trying to run an entire kingdom that doesn't like him. While all this is going on, Ha'alilo and Richards they're this close to getting the damn thing signed. And news gets back to the Admiralty of this incident, and they're pissed. And Paulette's boss, Admiral Thomas, he hears about this on the west coast of South America, comes over to Hawaii, basically just tells Paulette to get lost, return sovereignty to Hawaii, and this is La Ho'iho'i'a, the return of sovereignty. And Thomas Square downtown is named after Admiral Thomas. There's these huge parties that lasted for days apparently, and so Hawaii got its independence back, and this is where we get Ua Maoka'ea o Ka'aina i Kapono. The ea, the life or liberty of the land, is preserved in righteousness, is preserved in the pono, it's preserved in the correctness. And is it talking about Thomas did a pono thing and the righteousness, the ea is preserved through that? Or is it talking about, no, Hawaii was pono, we acted in a pono way, and that's how come our ea was preserved? That's different interpretations. Either way, we ended up with La Ho'iho'i'a. We ended up with our independence back, but we still didn't have recognition. We still don't have the treaties. And pretty soon after that, in November, we get the treaties. Ha'alilo and Richards, they get the treaties signed by the British and the French on November 28th, 1843, which means the Americans will probably go along, and they do come along in a couple of years. And they have to. These are agreements to work towards more substantial treaties. And this is how diplomacy works. We are going to reach an agreement to eventually reach an agreement. But that moment right there, that November 28th, 1843, that is the moment that it secures Hawaii's international recognition, which means they recognize us as a country that deserves its independence. And that falls under the norms of behavior among countries, which means they can't just show up and take the damn thing over. It would be a violation of not. Okay, international law is a joke. There's no such thing as actual international law because there's no international cops. But it's the expected behavior between countries. And the British and French put a lot of faith behind this because this is what has kept Europe from, even though they slaughter each other all the time, it's essentially what has kept them from having empires rule over them instead of being the empires ruling over people outside of Europe. It's the, Westphalian state system. But at the end of the day, for Hawaii, what it means is that the Americans, British, and the French agree that we deserve to be an independent country, and that they're not going to try and take us over, and that we have treaties, which make it a lot more difficult to go and invade a country that you have a treaty with. Not impossible, as we'll see in about 50 years, but difficult. And the two bases for a lot of this diplomacy, the arguments that they put forward were the Constitution, Christianity. We're a nation of rules, and we're a Christian nation. As a nation of rules and a Christian nation, you cannot come in and invade us in good faith. And it worked. It effectively worked. The other major thing and the other major controversy of Kamehameha III's reign is the Great Mahele. So how land tenure used to be held was, and this is very rough because it's going to differ from time to time, place to place, but roughly this is how it worked. The land is held by a mo'i, or king. Wouldn't have been called a mo'i until you get to like Kamehameha II. An ali aimoku, an ali that consumed the district, ali aimoku. Or the not district, but the island. Although sometimes it would be just a district if there was no ruler over the whole island. He would hand out lands to different people, and chiefs and followers mostly, and usually some big chunks of land. Like maybe someone might get the whole Waianae district, unlikely, but more likely they get certain lands within Waianae, certain lands within Ko'olau, certain lands within Ko'olau Poko. So you get little chunks of land. Those chiefs are essentially able to rule over those lands and pull the resources out, as long as you still got to kick something back to the king, but you're able to rule and pull the lands out. But most of this is going to be, they're going to be administered by konohiki. The konohiki are not rulers. It's not like the king, or even like these chiefs, although often these people would be chiefs, that these chiefs are given land for their own use. Konohiki are land managers. They're the ones, land and water managers. And under Kamehameha II, Kamehameha III, a lot of these lands were actually under Kahumanu. Because Kahumanu didn't really want to give out a lot of lands, a lot of it is administered by these konohiki. And they're agents of the king or the agents of the chief that do the sort of day-to-day management of the land. And then the people who are actually working the land are the makainana. Right? These are the farmers, the fishermen, the people who are actually, some of the chiefs did labor, some of the konohiki did labor, but the bulk of the labor is going to be done by the makainana. Like Kamehameha III, or Kamehameha I had his own lo'i, and he worked in the taro patch. But the majority of the kalo that was gathered under the Kamehameha for his own personal use and to deliver out to his retainers and his followers was not handpicked by the king. Most of the labor is going to be done by the makainana. And oh man, so one of the problems with this is we have this pulled through the writings of people in the 19th and 20th century who are also thinking about European and American systems of capital, labor, and management. So it gets kind of messy, and they're reading some of the European stuff onto this. In addition, this is how the system is during Kamehameha's time. We don't know that much about how the system was before Kamehameha's time. So there's a bunch of asterisks all over this thing, but this is roughly how it worked. Then the mission comes in and they're like, okay, we want to reform, we have land reform. Instead of the king handing out lands to chiefs, oh yeah, how did the makainana get on the land? We should add that in. Okay. So the makainana basically had gathering rights in the forest. They had the right to go and gather food. They had the right to go and gather things that they use for, craft resources, etc. And for the most part, you're on lands. Your family might have land somewhere that they've been farming for a long time. And usually there's just some sort of agreement with whoever the konohiki that comes in, an acknowledgement that these are the people who work this particular piece of land. You can be removed from it. It's just usually they're not going to be going around and removing people willy-nilly just for no reason. I've read some stuff about during Kamehameha's reign, because he's bringing all these Maui and Big Island people to Oahu, that there is a lot of displacement of makainana in order to be replaced by makainana, or like replaced by other people. And that would be very disruptive. But for the most part, for the most part, people seem to be left alone as long as they're following whatever rules the Konohiki sets by, the management sets by. Um, okay, so the mission comes in and they're going to push for what they call land reform. And one of the big things they're looking at is the American dream is to own your own property. It's private property, and they had the sort of the yeoman, the small farmer. And they looked, they're all from New England. A lot of them, even if they went to Yale, were farmers' kids. And they saw the world, like they saw small farmers are like the perfect person because they're independent, they're their own farmer, but they're not super rich or anything that they're going to be corrupt. They wanted an America run by small farmers, and this is the Jeffersonian yeoman ideal. And they import this guy, that idea to Hawaii, and they say, okay, we want Hawaiian yeoman farmers. We want Hawaii to be composed of small farmers running their own land. And they argue that this will save the Makainana. They argue that it's not these diseases that are killing everybody, it's that people don't have their own land, and because they don't have their own land, they're not willing to work very hard. Because they're not working very hard, they're not growing enough food, and that's why people are dying. It's kind of a garbage argument because cholera gives you the shits and then you die. And lots of people are dying of the shits. Not because they're not growing food, they're dying because diseases are killing them. Anyway, that was their argument. And this is going to... I'm going to move this over here because I notice I keep looking over at this part of the screen where the little thing is. So I'll move that over there so I'm looking at it. That's one of the arguments that they're making, is that this will somehow magically save the Makainana once they have private property. It's a garbage argument, but that's, the basis for capitalism is this idea that private property will save everybody. The other argument that is made, and this is more made, arguments that are made now to support the Great Mahele, although they could be made then too, was that in events like Tahiti, if Tahitians didn't own private property, so when the French took over, the French then claimed all of the land in the islands, and they continued using kind of the old system, but they basically claimed all of the land of the islands. And the argument was that if Hawaiians had private property, the French or British or Americans, if someone invaded, they would respect the private property of people in ways that they would not respect the property of a king or property of the nation in general. So that's one argument for it. And then finally, Kamehameha and Kahumanu, well, mostly Kamehameha, had sold lands. And it was unclear what he meant by selling lands. And this is how you end up with things like Charlton. And chiefs had sold lands to people without Kahumanu's permission, without Kamehameha III's permission. And there was like, well, what happens with this? We've already had one British invasion over these questionable land sales. Do we really want to deal with more? Well, let's just figure out a way for these land sales to be sort of established and permanent. And what they weren't saying, oh, well, they're saying to each other, not to the Hawaiians, is that they wanted to break the Ali'i's strength. They wanted to break the strength of the Konohiki. They wanted to restructure the relationships between people from the Hawaiian system, where it's between chiefs and commoners, to an American system where it's between capitalists and labor. They wanted to restructure things in the same way that it worked in America. And it's easy to look at that and say, like, well, you imperialist bastards. In their minds, they're doing a good thing because they think America is perfect. Okay, well, not perfect, but their vision of America, their idealized version of America, they think that's perfect. They want that to be Hawaii. In the long run, it's like, yeah, like that did not, like, capitalism didn't work out that great because look how, like, it's really easy to come in with money and buy up a bunch of land, and all of a sudden everyone else has to move to Vegas with their cousins. So they're trying to break those relationships. They're trying to recreate new relationships based on capitalism. Another part is a lot of the missionaries wanted land for their kids. Other foreigners wanted land. And then at the end of the day, so much of American economics and the American idolization of the yeoman farmer and private property, real estate, like owning land, is so essential to how they viewed the world, that they just viewed anything else as uncivilized, including whatever the Hawaiians are going to do. If it's not private property, they would see it as uncivilized. Like, these are the other things that are sort of going on. And it ends up in 1848, 1850, you end up with the Mahele, and it has multiple steps. They study things, they figure things out, they go and look and figure out if there's lands that people had already claimed and what to do with those. There's a whole process, but essentially they say, well, look, the king, the chiefs, and the people all have a third interest in the land. Not a third of the land each, but they have about a third of the interest in the land, because the kings owned it, the chiefs ran it, and the people worked it. So the Mahele was meant to separate out their interests by dividing up lands. 1848, and Mahele means division, like dividing up. The king in 1848 got dibs. He went through and claimed all the lands, and it wasn't a third of the lands, but he basically said, these are all the lands that I want. And they were important lands for him, they're important lands for his family. Some were religious or cultural importance, but a lot of them were like nice, good lands for certain products. Nice green lands, good fishing lands, etc. These all become the crown lands. So he claims those lands as the mo'i, and whoever is the next mo'i will get those lands. He then takes half of those and donates that to the government, not the king, but the government, and those become the basis for the government lands. The high chiefs and the konohiki then make claims, and they can argue for, like, well, I get this land, this land. Wait. I'm going to get these lands because these are lands that are important to me or to my family, that we've had long connections to. I will claim these lands. The konohiki are able to claim smaller lands that they've, like, my family has managed these lands for a long time, or I have the right to manage these lands, and then give back a chunk of everything. Everything you take, you had to give it back a chunk. And so the government lands are growing as well. And that's going to be the basis for, like, government resources. And then the makainana, except most of the makainana don't claim anything, because, one, there's tons of land and not that many people, so why claim things? Two, if you claim stuff, you're probably going to piss off whoever, konohiki, etc., that's running the area. And a lot of these areas, the chief or konohiki might have claimed a whole area where a bunch of people are living, and you could go and claim your individual plot within that land, but you're going to piss off whoever claimed the whole thing. And as long as you're living there and doing the same thing you'd been done before, there's not really seen as like a need for it. And you have to pay money. You got to pay money to get your land, not to purchase the land, but to survey the land, and to file all the paperwork. And a lot of Hawaiians were like, we don't have the money or the resources to do that. And I don't see the need to do that because I can just continue working the land like before. Like, nothing seems to have actually changed. Okay, and the Maka and Ana don't have to give back half of what they claim because their claims were limited by law to basically enough land to feed a family, and a small nuclear family, not a large extended Hawaiian family. Which also, like, we will see this based on what Kahumanu did before. We're seeing more and more people defining it as the American style nuclear family, just mother, father, kids as family, rather than broader relations where you might be living with, 3 cousins, 2 uncles, an aunt, neither of your parents, but like 4 of your grandparents. And that was like, that would just be a relatively normal household. It's being redefined through religion and through this as nuclear families. Finally, one of the other things that happens during this era is 1845, they pass a law saying that how they can become citizens, and that citizenship is not going to be based on birth, but on sort of nationality. It's the same way that citizenship can switch in other countries. So we're forming a country here. So in other places you can become a citizen, and they say like, yeah, you can become a Hawaiian citizen. And people who are born here that are not, like, their parents may have been Americans, but if they're born here, they can argue that they are Hawaiian citizens, because that's how nation states work. It was the sort of racialization of this in sort of one of the things that's going on in the United States. So they're saying, like, yeah, but you brown people, if you come over, you cannot become an American. a court case will go through in the 1850s that'll help launch the Civil War, arguing that African Americans could not become American citizens. Um, in Hawaii, the 1845, they basically like, hey, are we going to do this as a racial thing? No. If you're in Hawaii, if you apply to be a citizen, you swear an oath, you're a citizen, um, and that's going to be that's going to remain the standard all the way through until the kingdom is overthrown. Is citizenship based on, are you part of the nation? Or are you loyal to the nation? That's it. Um, One of the things that a lot of Hawaiians were pissed off though was like, okay, we know that lots of people come into Hawaii and will swear oaths up and down and lie. So I don't think the oath won't make good haole into, it won't matter to the good haole because they're already going to be good, and the ones that are bad, and we've seen a lot of how they come into Hawaii and be incredibly corrupt, etc. Um, an oath's not going to change any of that. So maybe we should have something other than just an oath. And the the government is like, no, 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 the oath will be fine. And within months, a bunch of people who had signed oaths to become Hawaiian citizens so they could work for the government, then got other jobs in California or something, and we're like, nah, just kidding, we're not Hawaiian citizens anymore. Um, so they probably could have come up with a more rigorous process of doing this, but I would argue this is a good thing. This is how, if we're going to make a nation state, then you have to make a nation state that follows this sort of open embrace of what it means to be a citizen. Um, yeah. Um, Judd does. This is Judd Garrett. He does claim this will make Hawaii more secure. There is the counter argument to a lot of this is a bunch of the people that participated in the revolution that like in 1887 that took a lot of power from Kalakaua and the overthrow in 1893. A lot of those people claimed to be actually were Hawaiian citizens by law, um, but there it was this matter of like people claiming citizenship, having citizenship, but not actually having any sort of loyalty to the state. That did continue to be an issue. At the same time, this does bring Hawaii um, more in line with what were considered norms of behavior, um, at least among Europeans. Europeans, Americans, etc. They were, you could always become a citizenship with the racial exceptions. Like Hawaii does not have racial exceptions. We do not have you can't be black and become a citizen. You can't be Asian and become a citizen. You can't be a Native American and become a citizen. Those existed in the United States. So there's like, it does bring us more in line with international standards, except most of those international standards were run by very racist white people who cut out an exception that we will allow other white people to become citizens, and Hawaii did not do that. Um, yeah, but there are mass protests, and David Malo and others who had protested the Mahele, they protested this. They see it as like, okay, we want more guarantees that this will not be used as a way for the king to further separate himself out from the Makainana. We want to make sure we have relationships with the king, other than just citizenship, because it seems like we'd be easily displaced by the wealthy who could come in and offer to the king essentially wealth and foreign influence. Um, Effects of all of this. Yeah, dude. Look, it is going to weaken the ties that bind the people, the king, and the elite. Before, the king was dependent on the people the king was dependent on the Konahiki and the chiefs to administrate the land, and they were dependent on the Makainana to actually feed everybody. Now they own land. And if the Makainana before could just leave. If you're a bad chief, the Makainana leave. And if they leave, they go someplace else. Some other chief starts feeding them, gives them land. All of a sudden, his lands are worth a lot more because the people are working it. It's the resources that are coming out of that land that the people are making that go to the chief. If you're a bad chief and people leave, you have fewer resources, you are now a poor chief. But if the people leave now and you have land and you can just sell the land, then fuck the people. And that some of the chiefs take that route. Not all of them, obviously, but like some of them take that route. It does start weakening those ties and connections over generations. And it does strengthen the ability of landowners to profit off their lands, because if you own lands, you can take out a loan. Um, and we'll see native and how they like. And some of them will, like some natives, like some chiefs will make a ton of money, basically leasing and loaning. Princess Ruth is one of them. Others will lose everything because they will make, they'll sign loans, not be able to pay them off, and lose all that land. And then maybe they're not the one kicking the Makayanana off the land, but whoever it is that owned that debt, First Hawaiian Bank, ends up owning it. Um, oh yeah, that's the other thing. First Hawaiian Bank it's Bishop, but not Sereno Bishop, who was like super racist. But James Bishop who marries Pauahi. You end up First Hawaiian Bank eventually. Anyway, that's a future lesson. So that's it for this week. Go get together as a group. Go work on the Constitution stuff. Let me know if there's any questions, and I'll see everyone next week. I hope that recorded.